Hi, welcome to my little world of wood carving. Now, if you're watching this video, you're obviously interested in getting started with carving. So this lesson is pretty much getting you familiar with how to hold the tools, how to safely use them. I'm just going to really sort of get you started with the very basics, as if you've never picked up a gouge before. And well, when I first started, I actually attempted to teach myself. I had picked up a carving book at a garage sale and a very dull chisel and a big rubber mallet, and I think I had a rasp and a lot of sandpaper. And anyway, I got a piece of scrap wood and I started to carve this face, and it's a man's face, and it was one of the designs in the book, and I had the desire to carve, and I just wanted to do it so badly. I started and just hacking away with that huge mallet and chisel about as sharp as a butter knife, and the harder you hit it, the easier it goes through. I used a lot of strength during that, and I actually have kept that project. I still have it, and I actually bring it to wood carving classes, my beginning carving classes especially, to show really, you have to start somewhere, and if you can show that sort of determination just to start. And so I look back at this, and you remember that determination, that drive, that just, I just wanted to make shapes. I wanted to make something look like something. And he's got a nose and sort of eyes and mustache, so you can sort of tell that it's a face. You have to start somewhere, and I would encourage you to keep that first piece that you carved, even if you're not really happy with it. At the time, I was looking at this going, oh my goodness, I've got to get further than this. And I would encourage you to keep that, because you look back at it, and years later you look at it and say, wow, look how far I've come. But as a result of attempting to teach myself, that's actually when I went out seeking for a teacher. And it really helps, I think, having somebody actually walk you through things. And if it's not an actual in-hand class, in-person class, the next best thing basically is video. So that's what this is about. You can watch exactly what I'm doing, the very subtle movements of the cuts, and really, I just want to get you started, because I absolutely fell in love with this art immediately. Even carving this guy, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who are as eager to learn this art as I was. So thank you for joining me. Now, first of all, I just wanted to introduce you to some of the gouges. Now, I have another lesson on the school that is really about gouges, really focusing on gouges. But I wanted to stress the importance of using the long-handled gouges, simply because, and I'll show you how to hold these, I use both hands. Okay, one hand is always on the wood, one hand is always on the metal. All right, and it's a good idea to get a really good solid hold on the whole tool with both hands, because that is going to control what is being cut. If you just sort of hold it like that, or maybe like that, or like this, there's a lot of areas where you can sort of not get that guiding control. And by holding it like this is the most secure way of just making sure that those cuts, first of all, are safe cuts. You're not cutting towards yourself. No body parts are on this side of the blade. Both hands are on the tool at all times. One way of making sure that you have your hands in the correct position is basically if your thumbs are together like so. Okay, now they might be sort of in different positions as you sort of move, but it's not like this where your thumbs are both in the same direction. Okay, and so just make sure as you're doing this that that is in the right position. Now there's going to be maybe some areas where you may have to sort of remove some of those fingers there if it gets really sort of in cramped positions. That's, you know, there are exceptions where you're just going in such awkward shapes, and maybe if you're doing some big sculpture pieces, you may be able to, or you may have to just reposition them, but just make sure you're really conscious of safety and that you're not cutting towards yourself. All right, if there's anything where you have to cut towards yourself like that, even if it's just 1 or 2 cuts, I would really encourage you to stop, turn the wood around, and cut away from you. Okay, no matter how much wood is between you and the chisel, there's always that one moment where you're just not quite sure, or you're putting pressure on it in sort of an odd way that it slips. And I don't want to see anybody get hurt in this process. The carving part of it is too fun to create injuries. Okay, so another thing that I would encourage you and to do is, you see, you hold it like that. All right, now I am right-handed, so this way, holding the handle with my right hand really comes natural for me. That's the first way that you grab it, and that's really is very comfortable. Now this hand is also doing some guiding, my left hand, but basically your leading hand, which if you're ambidextrous, that's great, because you're going to have a much easier time, because there's going to be times when I will have to turn it around and go in the other direction and basically lead with the left hand. Now it's amazing to me how quickly you can adapt to using your left hand. Quite often I teach like a 1-day or a 2-day class, and usually by the end of the first day, once you sort of force yourself through that sort of awkward stage of actually figuring out how it's held in your left hand, or whichever hand you're not comfortable with, it's amazing how quickly that once you force yourself through that difficulty, it becomes second nature. It really does. Now, the interesting thing is I can pretty much do both hands with right or left hand, but if there's ever a point where I'm doing a lot of real strength work, where I'm really having to push hard through the wood, that's when I turn the wood around and aim sort of using my right hand, because my right hand is a lot stronger, my right arm is a lot stronger than my left. So if you know you're going to be doing a lot in sort of one direction and you need that strength, then you can certainly do that. Now the thing is, if you were not able to sort of switch it around from right and left hand, the main reason you would do that is because of the grain direction, and well, any design really, design ideas or designs where you're just sort of having to go back and forth and back and forth, and sometimes in just like a minute or two you're going back and forth from right and left hand quite a few times, and I find that quite often. And if you were not able to switch hands, then you would actually have to turn the wood every time, and that's a lot of work and it's very tedious, clamping it, unclamping it, clamping it, unclamping it. So I would definitely encourage you to get over that awkwardness and start from the very beginning using that hand that you're not comfortable with. Now I've got these interesting little calluses, very hard calluses on my hands right at the base, because when I'm carving I am pretty much constantly having that area of my hand touching the wood at all times, and that is where the control is going to come. It's sort of rotating off that as I'm making curved cuts. It's rotating no matter whether it's a right or left hand. You're using that, and you know, if you have a small piece of wood, sometimes you're actually bracing it on the bench itself, or maybe on the bench dog or something else, or maybe along this edge, something like that, where it's touching some part of this side of the arm. and just as long as it's braced, because if I didn't do that and I was just carving along and with no guidance, there's no control. And so a combination of having it braced against the wood, held tightly there and held tightly along the handle, and you really, it's amazing how much control you get, and then just do the twisting cuts and everything. So I would really encourage you to do that, and build up a nice callus. You may want to wear carving gloves, or what I often use are fingerless carving gloves, or actually they end up being more sort of bicycle gloves or weightlifting gloves. They have sometimes a pad on the palm, and the part of my hand that actually gets worn the most or calloused the most is this side of my arm or my hand, because of a lot of times it ends up sort of rubbing along the edge of wood, and a lot of times that part is really what ends up actually getting cut sometimes, because you run it along the edge of the wood, not necessarily cut from the tools or cut from the gouges, but actually from sharp edges of wood. And so that's why that the fingerless gloves really do help, especially if you're going to be carving in harder woods like mahogany or walnut. Now that I mentioned that, I will suggest sort of beginning carving woods. I mentioned walnut and mahogany, but those are probably not really considered beginner because of they're such hard woods. They're beautiful to carve, but while you're just sort of learning, I would suggest basswood, definitely a good starter wood, and that's what I'm going to be demonstrating on here. Either basswood, and I would suggest also that the type of basswood you use is the northern basswood. All right, so northern basswood, Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, those areas, it's a tighter grain because of the harsh winters. Now, if you get something from Tennessee or Georgia, the basswood tends to be a little bit stringier, a lot more grain. So if you really want that very clean, white, you really can barely see the grain on some of the northern basswood. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Just make sure, if you can, if they'll give you the information of where it's sourced from, yeah, definitely stick towards the northern part of the U.S. And then there's another wood called butternut. Very, very nice, nice wood to carve. It's soft. It's got some very nice grain to it. Here's an example of butternut. You see it's got beautiful grain. You can see the back of it, and you can make it look like walnut. You can make it look like oak. You can really do some beautiful staining with it. Now it's very soft, so you have to probably seal it, or it will sort of work with like soft woods, and sort of the end grains will get darker. But the butternut is really beautiful wood to carve. It's getting to be a little bit more scarce because there's been some type of either a fungus that has been killing some of the trees up north. But if you can find it, definitely I would encourage you to use that as a starting wood. It's not real strong. Neither basswood or butternut are very strong, so you wouldn't necessarily build a piece of furniture with it, but you can sort of add decorations and do the practice carving with that. Then I would go into walnut or mahogany. The walnut, I actually like walnut more than mahogany these days because it's a little bit more consistent. Just make sure you've got nice straight grain black walnut. The mahogany is going in every different direction nowadays. You get some that's very, very hard and stringy. You get some that's very soft and spongy. There's what they call Philippine mahogany. There's the African mahogany. There's the, sometimes you can access the South American mahogany still, but, and they're all so vastly different. What you see quite often now is what's called sapele. Grain is just going in every different direction. Challenging to carve, beautiful wood, but so it's a little sort of hit or miss of whether you can really find some good quality mahogany. and what you can just sort of buy out there standard is sometimes just not good enough to carve. Make sure you get some really, really tight grain. You don't want to have anything too sort of squirrely or stringy or again, it's kind of more of a of a hit or miss of whether you actually can get some good quality mahogany. Now, if you can get a hold of the Honduran or the Peruvian or something, you know, that's basically hardly accessible these days, it's beautiful, beautiful to carve. Now, a lot of times, people that I work with that are furniture restorers, I get the opportunity sometimes to work on antique mahogany. I mean, because they've been either had tables or something where they've salvaged basically, and so I got to use some of their really, really beautiful South American mahogany. So if you have access to that, have fun with it, but I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to start with it. Now, there's other woods out there. There's oak, red oak, white oak. Hard wood to carve, difficult. I would probably sort of back away from that for a while. Definitely wouldn't start with it. Then there's the cherry, which can be sort of equivalent to walnut in the sort of texture and hardness, probably a little bit harder. That's something else that you could carve. Again, not necessarily beginning carving wood, but you know, maybe after you've carved 3 or 4 different projects, you're confident and you've sort of built up the strength in your hands, and then go to something like walnut. Let's see, some of the other ones, poplar. A lot of people do like carving in poplar, but I generally don't. It's actually kind of stringy and I don't know, it's just something about it. It fights me whenever I try to carve it. But it's generally soft, usually softer than something like oak or whatever. But, if you want to try it, you may be one of those people that absolutely loves poplar. I don't. Let's get started with some carving. I just want to show you really just some basic carving cuts just to get you started, to get you hooked into it. Now I want to start by just simply taking my V-chisel, and this is my V-chisel. It's actually shaped like a V, and it's got flat sides and it's got an outside corner. And I use the V-chisel quite often at beginning projects to actually remove sort of the bulk of the wood, especially in relief carving projects where I'm lowering down the background. I actually outline the design with the V-chisel. So I do use the V-chisel quite often. And a lot of times it's just removing the bulk of the wood. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start. Now, depending on how your V-chisel is sharpened, there's times when you just have to sort of just rock it back and forth to feel where it's going to catch the wood. Okay, and then once you sort of feel it's catching the wood, and I'm just going to push it forward. And notice this hand is down hard against the wood, and then just going to create that curve. Okay, and now what's happening is I've actually got my hand positioned like that, and it's actually pushing forward. Again, my thumbs are together, and both hands are really working very hard. They're both squeezing this and controlling it pretty much equally. Okay, and then as I'm coming along there, just going to continue. Now I wanted to show you just another option. Right now I just am pushing through. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, first of all, let's just draw a line right here. Okay, I'm going to show you how to control of where that V-chisel is going to stop. Because right now, if I'm just pushing through, especially when you're working with harder woods, but you're putting a lot of effort into that, and it can slip very easily. So as I'm coming in here, as I get up to that point, I sort of do a little bit of a wiggle, little wiggle cut, and that sort of walks the tool a little further forward, and it stops where you want it to stop. I do that little wiggle cut a lot if I know that I just can't go past that certain point. Now I'm going to show you this next part, and I'm going to use a mallet. All right, and this is a little brass mallet, and it weighs just under 1.5 pounds. It's enough to just very, very lightly tap. And a lot of times I think people think that the mallet is used for just hammering away, you know, like I did with my very first carving. Just the bigger the mallet, the better the carving is going to go. But this technique I'm going to show you here is actually more of a controlling cut, a controlling mallet. Okay, so as I'm coming around here, just very lightly tap it. And then I can take and just sort of go around, and my whole body moves around a curve. And then as I get close to where I want to stop, little lighter tap, and then let that go. Now, so let me just show you this next part. Straight. And then stop. Okay, and let me just show you the next one. I'll just push through it. Okay, pushing through, it's a little bit less controlled, cut. Let me just do another one, sort of a repeat of that. And I'm going to use my mallet on the whole thing. And I have discovered that using the mallet, especially when you've got really tight curls to make, it really controls it much nicer than trying to push it through. And watch my body position as I'm curving around. So I'm going to start like this. And I'm keeping the actual position of my hand and the tool in the same position, but I'm actually just sort of walking along. Now, there's been a question of whether it's better to stand or sit when carving. I prefer to stand, simply because of that motion and that movement, that flexibility I can do as I'm sort of going around in all the different areas. Now, if you are disabled, if you have a bad back or bad knees, and you need to sit down, definitely I would encourage you to do that. Maybe sit on a stool so you're a little higher up, so you may be able to sort of lean into the carving a little bit more. But if you look at how I'm doing this, I really am sort of pressing, and I'm positioned right over the carving, so that by doing this I'm really actually my body itself is moving with the cuts. Okay, I'm just going to carve a cute little, I don't know, tadpole or worm or something. But basically, I just want to do this, something that has a lot of curve in it. And I'm just going to sort of walk you through the very basic technique of carving a relief carving, where you've got the background outside, lowered down, and then this design sort of raised up. Now, because basswood is really very forgiving when it comes to grain, I'm just going to take my V-chisel and I'm going to go all the way around the outside edge. I'm not really going to worry about what direction the grain is going or anything like that, because this isn't really a very fragile piece. The only fragile piece is maybe the end of the tail there, and there's an area that I'll be a little more cautious with. But I'm going to take my V-chisel, and I'm going to go around the outside, and I'm going to leave the line visible. I'm going to take it around the outside and just go, try to get the same depth all the way around the outside. It's just simply outlining that design. And I'm going to use my mallet. Let's just start right here. Okay, now notice I'm leaving the line visible. And I'm just coming along. Now, as long as your V-chisel is really sharp, you may want to review the sharpening tools lessons. As long as your V-chisel is very sharp, you should be able to just sort of walk it through and wander along the edge. You may come across some issues where the grain does sort of fight with you, but I think we're pretty much okay for this one. Okay, so I just used my mallet right along the edge, and I pretty much kept this, the V chisel pretty much even. I didn't really sort of lean it one side or the other. The problem is if you lean it too far, that side, it's very easy for that corner to go under the wood right here and really tear up that outside. So I just pretty much kept it even, just straight where each side was an equal angle. Okay, so just don't really need to sort of adjust it as you go. Now I'm going to try to explain the process of going with the grain and against the grain. And I'm going to walk you through that on this. And so a lot of times when you've got the grain, it's a little difficult with basswood. You can kind of see this. The grain is going basically in this direction. Okay, so if you look at that, find these areas that are at that top of the hill. Okay, basically there's a hill there. All right, and I'm just going to sort of draw a line like that. And basically at that point, at that tangent where that horizontal line of the grain meets that high point, this is where, when I start rounding something over, like let's say I'm going to do this side here, I want to go from that tangent, I'm going to go from there in that direction. I might have to use a different pen here. Okay, and then when I round this part over, let's just say I'm going to be taking this tool here and rounding it over. All right, and this is a number 314, but I'm going to be taking that and going in that direction, and from there and going in that direction. So because what happens is, if I come in that direction, what's going to happen, if you see that, that's actually cutting into the grain right there, and that is considered cutting against the grain. So I want to start from basically that hill, where the top of the hill, if you've got a peak like that, you want to start there and go in that direction. So let me just do that for now. Now I've got this tool turned sort of upside down. The bevel side is up. Now it may let me do this. Sometimes it gets a little awkward, a little too close to the wood, especially for this very shallow relief carving. And if you have seen the sharpening video, this is where that inside bevel, a slight inside bevel, might work better for that, and it actually allows you to lift it off the wood slightly and give you a little bit more room. Okay, I'm not worried about that sort of mess right there. And so now from this point, I'm going to go from this point down in this direction, and then I'm going to come right to the point where, let me draw another tangent line right there, and then that's the point when the grain switches. All right, let me just do that. I'm going to come like that. And right at the bottom, I'm going to stop, because if I try to continue up that edge, then I'm going to snag that and it's going to be cutting into that grain. So this is going with the grain right here. And as I'm coming up here, I'm just going to sort of blend it into that surface. All right, so I really can't go much further than that. And I also wanted to explain a little bit, what I'm doing here is a trick with making something look a little bit deeper than it actually is. And that's simply rounding over these areas, just the edges, more aggressively, and then leaving this sort of general larger, flatter area, leaving it relatively flat. And when you look straight on, it gives the appearance of it being a lot deeper than it actually is. It's very similar to if you look at a quarter or a coin close up. You look at it and it's got basically a very, very flat surface, but just at the edges, it really aggressively curls around, curves around, just at the edges, giving that face of, let's say, George Washington, of a much deeper appearance just simply by those edges. It's like it gives you clues right along the edges, and then you fill in the blanks. So that's what we're trying to do here, just along the edges and rounding that over. So I'm not going to be touching much of this inside, maybe just to get rid of those lines. All right, so now again, okay, we've got this one. There's a peak right there. All right, that's the peak. Now the same thing here. Go like that. If you look at the grain, the peak is right about there. And therefore, from right at that point, that's where it comes. You go in this direction and this direction. Okay, starting in this direction, and then go right down into that. Now if I would try to continue that up this edge, then I would start to go against the grain right there. Okay, I'm just going to take this. Now when I first started carving, I really didn't have that many tools, so and this was one of the first ones that I had. This is the 314, and so what happens is I've actually learned to do a lot of things with this gouge that probably wasn't meant to have done. Like for instance, right here, it's as I start going over the top, the sort of more to the flatter area, this side of the tool most likely will dig in if I try to pursue, curving that a little bit further in. So what I tend to do is turn the tool over, bevel side down, and then I'm just going to come in here and blend it into that surface. And then just take tiny, tiny little facets off, and eventually that will just blend in, and by taking facets off along a curve, it starts to create that final curve. Okay, so same thing here. I'm just going to come in and just remove that, remove the lines really. I'm erasing right now, but it's also blending this the curve along the edge into that flat surface, because you can often see the plain marks across the surface, and then you've got this carved area, and if it doesn't transition nicely, it'll be real obvious that there's these sort of curves along the edge. All right, I just want to do this side here now, and then I'll fix up that. Okay, so at this point I'm going to turn this over, and it really ends up being using it like it's a flat chisel. Now I could also use a flat chisel, but I've got the tool in my hand, and quite often I do that. I just sort of flip it back and forth. Okay, now I'm going to take my V-chisel one more time and just go right into the base there and just sort of clean up that the rough area, just to kind of make it look a little nicer in there. Not really removing much wood. Okay, now there's this little area here, and this happens quite often on sort of the inside curve. You're going down here in that direction, and on the inside curve there's this little hook. It's basically where the grain changes at the bottom of that hill. So before you start sort of trying to dig in each side, which is very easy to do, because okay, well, it's not cleaning up, I got to come in that side and that side. Pretty soon you've got this big deep corner that you can't really clean out, and it ends up being a corner. So what I'm going to do is take a gouge that is slightly more curved than this curve here, all right, because I don't want those corners to dig into that area. So I'm going to come across here and very, very lightly just scrape across that area and take out that area that's right at that area where the grain switches. Now that's a cut I use quite often because you're always going to end up coming into that area. You're down at the bottom of the hill, and it just can't clean out. Stop before you go too far and come across the grain. And that cut, let me just show you it again, that cut is actually slicing it as I go across. Okay, now I'm just going to finish the bottom part here. Again, this is considered that sort of peak, all right? The grain is going like that, like that. All right, so basically at that area right there, from that point I go in this direction. And from this point I go in that direction. And then I stop. You see this curves back around. Take this. I stop right at the height where this grain joins that perpendicular, that tangent. All right, joins there. And so that's coming in that direction. And then come in this small little area at the end of the tail, which probably is the most critical at this point. Like I said, basswood, you can get away with a lot. I could probably do this whole thing against the grain, and it might struggle and might fight a little bit, but I probably could get away with it. But there's little areas like that, which I probably wouldn't be able to get away with. So let me just first do this part, and then I'll show you how to do the rest. So as I'm coming along here, starting there, and then as it's coming up towards that flat area, do you see how I have to actually reposition my hands? I can't really do that full grip like that because it's too flat against the wood. And so what I'm going to do is turn it over and bevel side down and just take little facets off and create more of a curve on that surface by taking flat segments. And just tiny little cuts. Now there is a tendency by doing this where you can actually see a lot of the gouge marks, a little bit more than if you were going to be taking and turning it over. But it does get a little awkward. You can probably easier do more along the base here, right along the edge there, rather than up along the surface, because this corner of the tool will sort of dig in and cause issue along that center. Okay, so same thing here, and I'm going in this direction, starting from that line. And then I have to stop right there, because this is the part that if I would try to pursue that cut all the way along there, I would probably end up breaking some of this off because it's going right against the grain. It would actually cut into there and potentially split that. All right, now at that point I stop and then come in this direction. And again, this is going to be another one of those that has a little bit of that sort of inside curve that, actually that worked pretty well. But that's the type of area where you get that sort of snag, where you have to come across the grain. Okay, now I'm just going to take my V-chisel very, very lightly to sort of clean up that inside edge. Not really carving any deeper right there, but just cleaning up any rough edge. And now I'm going to show you, I'm going to make a smiley face on this. He's going to be a happy worm. And we'll just do a round eye there. Okay, now I'm going to use a number 514, okay? And again, talking about the tools, I would definitely refer to or watch the lesson on tools and how they're numbered. And this is one cut there, all right, a slight angle, and then another cut just like that. And that is a happy, happy worm. And now what I'm going to do for the eye, this is a little veiner tool, all right, it's shaped like a U, and I'm just going to come around like this and just spin that tool around and just make a hole there. Basically use it like it's a drill. Okay, well there we have a happy worm. Now if you want to take and sand the surface, you certainly can, and just really get rid of a lot of those facets. I tend to like to leave the tool marks. It gives it a little bit of life. And now there's a little bit of sort of red marks from the lines that I drew, and so the sanding might get rid of that also. And so if you look at this, you can see this is relatively flat. I haven't really touched anything across that surface, but just really rounded from about there down and from about there down, and it gives the illusion that this whole surface is curved. So if as you're looking straight on, it gives more of that illusion. Now I'm just going to make a few just sample cuts, just a little bit more on how to use the tools. And this is a number 7/6 millimeter that I'm using, and I'm just going to make a cut like that. It's really just a stop cut. And then I'm going to come in this direction and just come up and complete that cut. And it just ends up getting a very interesting shape. All right, but you don't want to let the corners of the tool go underneath the wood. Okay, and that's the type of thing you can do sort of a pattern if you want to make just a kind of an interesting design, maybe even a border. Now watch what I'm doing at the very end. I just do a little bit of a wiggle, or I can use a mallet, and the mallet is going to just let me gently go up to that edge. Okay, by using the mallet, it's going to sort of stop me from going right up there. Now I often find that coming across the grain ends up actually being an easier cut sometimes, because at that point you're coming across the grain and you're not dealing with any grain issues. You're not dealing with the limitations of, oh, I can't go in that direction because that's going against the grain. Well, coming across the grain is really giving you a lot of freedom. So for instance, if I'm coming like this, let's make a cut with the grain like that. I'm going to get to a point where I'm going to try to come out. I'm just making a scoop right now, but I'm going to have to come in the other direction to actually complete that cut, because I won't be able to actually climb out of that cut. It'll just sort of string along and that piece of wood will rip. So in order to complete that cut, I have to go like that, and then of course you get that little area at the base that is very, very hard to clean out. And then I'm going to take, in order to clean that out, come across the grain, and again that's slicing right across the grain. Okay, and that cleans out that sort of hole. And then what I'm going to show you here is that same cut. If I do it across the grain, watch what I'm doing though. If you watch slowly, I've got a little bit of a slicing motion. I'm going forward, but I'm also slicing it, and that's going to help get through that wood. Okay, so if you look at that compared to that, very similar cuts, but I had complete control that whole process of making that cut rather than that cut. So there are some times when maybe you want to actually design your carving based on that process. If you can make those cuts going across the grain, but make sure that as you start that and you're taking that and it's a slicing cut like that. Slice the tool. You know, it's sort of like if you imagine, you know, taking a loaf of very soft bread, and if you just press down into it, if I just took this cut like that and pressed, it would just sort of crush the grain and it wouldn't really make a nice clean cut. Same thing with that bread. If you press down with a knife, it's just going to squish the bread. But if you take that knife and you slice it, it's going to very gently, you know, without damaging the bread at all, it's going to slice it right through. So that's the same concept, is take it and just make sure that it's, as you're going forward, it's also twisting. All right, let me just do a straighter one. I'm not going to make a hole necessarily, but let me just do a cut like that. So as I'm coming along there, it's such a subtle cut, but I would say in every cut that I make, especially the ones that are across the grain, like that, there is some of that slicing motion. Start from one side and twist. Now, naturally, the direction that I twist, the direction that I make that twist, if you imagine yourself putting your arm forward like that, that is a natural twisting. It is actually how your ligaments actually are positioned, doing basically the direction of a screwdriver. You know, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. And so it's the same technique. As you're extending that arm and moving it forward, let it go in that natural curve that your arm wants to go in. Now, there are times when, simply because of the grain and because of all the other issues with wood, there might be times when you have to sort of force it in the sort of more awkward twisting direction. But generally, if you're just simply trying to make cuts across the grain, that twist, the direction that you go, ends up being much more natural. Now I just want to show you a technique that I use. This is a technique that I use to make chip carving cuts. I don't use a standard chip carving knife. I actually just take my V-chisel, and this is going to sort of come down inside to an incised, basically an inverted pyramid. So I'm going to take my V-chisel from the corners. All right, and then I'm just going to do the same thing here. Now, don't do as I do. I was cutting towards myself. Don't do that. I'll tell you what, if you are going to be cutting towards yourself, what you want to do, and if there's that one time where like, it's only one cut, make sure you do this. All right, let's just do the example of that one. Step away from the wood. All right, so that if for whatever reason, I know this is, you know, there's a lot of wood there, but if you're just in that position where it might slip through, if it does slip, you're still away from the bench. If it does slip, it's going in that direction. So if you have to, and I wouldn't encourage you to, but if there's that sort of one cut where you're just sort of going backwards, just step away from the bench, make the cut, and then come back. Okay, so in other words, all cuts away from you, whether it's hands, body, whatever. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my flat chisel, and notice this is a fishtail, and that works really handy for this because you want to get that nice corner of the chisel right into the bottom of that V, or that pyramid. And then as I'm coming along here, I'm just going to sort of roll it forward and then come in this direction. Okay, and you get a nice little sort of inverted pyramid, and then come in this direction. And if you have seen chip carving, very similar results. I'm just using a flat chisel and a V-chisel. And this is a very nice border design if you wanted to make a frame or something. But I'm really controlling the tool. I'm really holding tightly as it's coming along. Now the bench height to carve with, if you're standing, ideal height is a couple inches below elbow height. All right, so this is pretty good for me. Otherwise, you end up sort of leaning over and it just ends up being hard on your back, on the neck if you have to lean over like that. If it ends up being too high, then you're having to lift your shoulders and sort of carve like that. That can be hard on your shoulders and also your neck. Now, it ends up being the actual height of your carving surface a couple inches below elbow height. So if you're standing like that and just it's a pretty comfortable height. Obviously it's a lot higher than your standard workbench. So I've got 6x6 blocks under my bench, and just I have this all the time because this is my carving bench. But if you have a standard size workbench, a lot lower, sometimes you can find there's a lot of plans out there on the internet of carving benches that you can actually put on top of your regular workbench and then carve on top of that. So you don't necessarily have to be raising your workbenches or actually changing it each time, because if you're going to be doing some planing, then you want it lower. If you want doing some carving, higher. Now it'd be great if you could sort of do a hydraulic thing, and I think they have them out there. But removing and adding 6x6s each time, that's not happening, especially as heavy as this workbench is. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about the ideal lighting for carving. Generally, if you have just general overhead lighting, fluorescent lights, quite often while you're carving, you're leaning into your carving, and it's very difficult because your head is creating a shadow. So I would encourage you to take several lights from both sides and be able to sort of shine them towards you, and that also is going to be creating a lot of shadow, which is a little easier to see what's actually happening in the carving. If you just have sort of a general light, it's going to be very hard to see depth and the specific shapes that you're carving. So it is a good idea to have something, maybe a flexible light with an arm or on an arm that you can sort of move and even reposition as you're carving, so that you can adjust it as you go, and it really ends up showing up completely different lights from one side to the other. And it's a good idea to be able to see that as you're carving. One of the tricks I use if I am really sort of getting bogged down in a carving and I don't really know where to go with it, and I'm not quite sure if I'm even happy with it, what I do is I take it off the bench and I look at it in a mirror. And it's fascinating because looking at it in the mirror, first of all, you've been staring at it, carving at it for however many hours you've been working at it, so you know everything about what's happening there. Well, you look at it in a mirror and it's completely different. You're seeing it from different eyes, and it's amazing that by doing that you can actually see different things that you would not have normally seen. So sometimes that helps. Sometimes if you just go away for either overnight or even an hour, step away from it, rest your eyes, and then come back and you start seeing things a little bit differently. You start noticing things, oh, I have to work on that. And then the cycle goes on and you never stop carving. Yeah, you need to know when to stop. So take some of these cuts that I've showed you and just practice with them and just play with them and make your own designs and try different cuts and practice sort of lifting the tool higher and see what happens there. It's probably going to go deeper. But see what happens and discover, and just take a scrap piece of wood like this. Don't worry what it looks like, and play around with it and try to make controlled cuts, because ultimately the controlled cuts are going to be what you can use when you're actually really trying to define something, when you're trying to carve that rose or carve that wonderful acanthus leaf. But that's where just gaining control of those tools. Hold it in your right hand, hold it in your left hand, and really gain control of where those tools are starting, where they're stopping, how deep they're going, and just practice. And even before you're really doing anything defined, any specific carving project, just play with it, get controls. In fact, when you're doing something like these cuts here, Do that all along the length of a piece of wood, it's amazing because by the time you get to that end, you can see the progress and the improvement of those cuts. By the time you get to the end of it, you know that cut, you know exactly what's going to happen with that tool. So I would really encourage you to do that and take your time with it and have a lot of fun.